Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because, well, we're going to look at one of the most fascinating and, frankly, complex historical paradoxes of modern history: India's systemic economic transformation under colonial rule. Think about it for a second. How did a region that was literally a global economic powerhouse turn into a stagnant, impoverished economy by the mid-20th century? We're going to use these slides to break down the exact mechanisms of this empire-building process.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just look at this massive 2% on your screen. It tells an incredible story. Back in 1750, India produced approximately 25% of the entire world's industrial output. That is huge, but by 1900, that number had plummeted to a mere 2%. And this wasn't just some gradual natural decline. It was a fundamental rewiring of an entire nation's economic engine.
So to understand how this actually happened, we have to look at the overarching framework provided by Dadabhai Naoroji, known as the drain of wealth theory. Naoroji was this brilliant colonial economist, and he realized that the colonial economy was operating essentially like a giant extraction machine. He estimated that a staggering 30 to 40 million pounds were being drained from India every single year. And the real kicker? This wasn't just a loss of current wealth. It was the loss of potential surplus, money that could have been invested right back into the country. Instead, it created this devastating, compounding cycle of poverty. Here is our roadmap for dissecting this economic machine today. We'll look at 1. Agriculture and the zamindari system, 2. The fall of Indian industry, 3. Infrastructure and foreign trade, 4. Occupational shifts, and finally 5. The demographic condition. Let's get to it. Section 1. Agriculture and the zamindari system, destroying the foundation. The colonial government came in and introduced entirely new land tenure systems that basically upended rural life within the agricultural sector. On one hand, you had the zamindari system, introduced in 1793, where landlords owned the land and extracted the absolute maximum possible rent. On the flip side, you had the Raitwari and Mahalwari systems. Now, under these, peasants supposedly retained ownership, but they faced crushing direct taxes. We're talking up to 50 or 60% on irrigated land. Regardless of which system you look at, the actual cultivator's prosperity was never the priority. The zamindari system, in particular, had truly devastating effects on the ground. Land ownership rapidly transferred away from the actual cultivators to wealthy moneylenders, driven by incredibly high rents and, honestly, widespread forged records. Because the landlords only cared about extracting revenue, they completely neglected any investments in land fertility or agricultural technology. Instead, peasants were forcefully coerced to cultivate commercial crops, like indigo for British textile mills. This completely plunged the rural economic structure into massive debt and stagnation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark, quantitative reality of those policies. When you force a massive shift from food crops to commercial cash crops, you are going to see a long-term decline in basic food availability. Between 1918 and 1947, food grain production per head dropped from about 200 kilograms down to just 150 kilograms. The population was growing, but their actual sustenance was shrinking. Moving on to Section 2. The fall of Indian industry, deindustrialization. Before British rule, India was globally renowned for its handicraft and textile industries. But the collapse of this industrial sector was so dramatic that William Bentinck, the Governor-General of India in the 1830s, reportedly observed, "The misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." It's a really grim quote, but it impartially captures the sheer scale of the economic displacement happening at the time. So the crucial point here is understanding the logic behind this collapse. It was driven by a very deliberate twofold motive. Step 1. Exploit India as a massive source of cheap raw materials, things like raw cotton and jute, to feed the booming industrial revolution back in Britain. Step 2, turn India into a captive consumer market for those newly manufactured, high-priced British goods. Through discriminatory tariffs where Indian exports were heavily taxed, but British imports flowed in freely, the domestic handicraft industry was just completely squeezed out. Section 3. Infrastructure and foreign trade. The extraction network. And this brilliantly illustrates the geographical footprint of the empire. The dark blue indicates areas under direct British rule, while the light blue shows indirect rule. Those direct rural areas are exactly where the colonial administration intensely built its extractive infrastructure, ensuring tight control over the most lucrative agricultural and commercial zones. When we think of infrastructure from this era, our minds immediately go to the railways. But here's the thing. These weren't necessarily built to connect local markets or spur domestic prosperity. Not at all. They were strategically designed to mobilize the army rapidly and, crucially, to funnel raw materials from the vast interior directly to the major ports. The railways were literally the physical arteries enabling Nauroji's drain of wealth. All of this infrastructure facilitated a massive transformation in foreign trade. Notice how pre-colonial India exported finished goods and imported precious metals. But under colonial rule, this flipped entirely. India became an exporter of primary raw materials like cotton and indigo, and an importer of finished British consumer clothes. Britain maintained a strict monopoly on this trade, which actually generated huge export surpluses for India. But those surpluses didn't benefit Indians. They were used to pay home charges, expenses incurred by the British government in London, which just further drained the economy. Which brings us to Section 4, Occupational Shifts, Forced back to the soil. Think about it. As the world-renowned artisan economy was ruined, those skilled workers had absolutely nowhere to go. They were forced back to the soil. By the time of independence, the occupational structure had drastically shifted. Over 72% of the population was engaged in an already stagnant agricultural sector. Manufacturing was left with a mere 10%. This created severe overcrowding on the land, dropping productivity even further and cementing widespread rural poverty. Finally, Section 5, Demographic Condition, the Human Toll. If we look at the timeline of the Indian census, which began systematically in 1881, we see a fascinating and really tragic demographic story. From 1901 to 1921, the population was completely stagnant, ravaged by high death rates from famines and epidemics. But 1921 is known by demographers as the year of Great Divide. After this point, the population started to grow steadily. Not necessarily because of sudden prosperity, though, but primarily because of a slight decline in the overall death rate. The actual reality of that 1921 census is chilling. Look at these numbers. Life expectancy was a shocking 32 years. Illiteracy stood at 83%. Infant mortality was high, and the overall birth and death rates were 48 and 40 per 1,000 persons, respectively. The vast majority of the population was spending 80 to 90% of their meager income just on basic necessities, and they still couldn't secure adequate food or shelter. This extreme vulnerability tragically culminated in events like the 1943-44 Bengal famine. This wasn't just a sudden natural disaster. It was the result of decades of policy. It was the culmination of that long-term decline in food per head we saw earlier. The subinfeudation within the zamindari system had left no one accountable for the welfare of the land. Add to that a wartime scorched earth policy that actually removed vital rice stocks to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands, plus the diversion of government funds from agriculture to civil defense. And you had a perfect, human-made storm that cost millions of lives. Which leaves us with this final vital question. When you look at an entire economic machine designed for extraction, from the zamindari system to the railways, how do those extractive infrastructures and massive economic shifts continue to cast a long, complex shadow over post-colonial developing nations today? It's a massive topic that really challenges how we view modern geopolitical history. I hope this explainer helped bring the incredible scale of this transformation into focus for you. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.